Oh, shaved my head today. Well, I did all along here, really
All along
much
here.
shorter than I meant to.
Oh yeah, no, you can't go back, can you?
You can't.
I thought.
I know. I was doing it all 5, and then I thought I'll just do a bit of 3, and then I saw another bit, and I thought, oh no, I have to do all 3 now. So
Yeah, no, you start at the top, don't you?
Yeah.
Go down a bit.
I can't start at the top. I have to be that spiky bit. Blimey.
Everybody, and welcome to Unpacked Lunch this week. Really glad that you're joining. As always, put your name in the comment, let us know you're watching. We'll be watching with you, and so expect a reply from one of us. It'll be nice to say hello. Let us know what you're having for lunch as always. And of course, if you have any questions around faith, life, or what we've been looking at in this series, which is Grand Designs as of Sunday, please put in the comments. We have got a brand new setup again. If you were watching on Sunday, Helen would have shown you the fancy green screen we've got, and so we're still trying to get used to that. And so we'd like to introduce you to our Unpacked Lunch kitchen. We're just pointing to a green screen at the moment, and so this is kind of weird because we're kind of talking in the future. Also, because we're part of a green screen, the way that we've set the camera up means that we're on these fancy stools, and my feet can't actually touch the bottom, which means that throughout this segment, I'm going to be going like this all the way around to have a look at our fancy kitchen. But Steve, glad that going around everywhere. Glad that you're with us.
Yeah, thank you.
We're in a series called Grand Designs,
Yeah.
which we're looking. Do you want to just explain the series really quickly and let us know what we're going to be looking at this month?
Yeah, certainly. Obviously, the name Grand Designs comes from the TV program with Kevin McLeod, and of how people look to build a house with a very special design about it. Often it is a grand design. It's big barn conversions or starting from scratch in beautiful areas. And God has a grand design for his church, and I believe he has a grand design for our church too. So we're exploring that over this month. This last week, looking at our mission and vision, and then moving forward as to what kind of community we want to be. What does it look like going back into gathering together, and also our responsibility as individuals to serve and to play our part within the church of God's grand design.
Excellent. My housemate loves Grand Designs, and so as I walked down on Sunday morning to go to church in order to do some of the tech stuff, he was watching the actual Grand Designs, and he was like, "I'm just doing some pre-reading." I said, "If that's what you think it's going to be, you're going to be a little bit disappointed, but maybe not." So we're looking at if God could build his church, or if God has built his church, what kind of people does he want us to become and the rest of it? So I thought it'd be kind of cool in Unpacked Lunch to look a little bit at the history of the Forge, of how we got here and the rest of it. And so the question I've got here is, how did the Forge come about? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I grew up going to church. We went along to a little brethren church. It was a tin hut of a gospel hall in the middle of nowhere.
That sounds like a country song.
Yeah, that's right. And it was made up of my family primarily, the Fenning family. And we held services, we did kids work, we did youth work, and it was never really going to grow because, one, the building was in the middle of nowhere. It was a funny looking building, and it was so family orientated. And I just felt, as I was growing up and I got into my teenage years, it was a hard place to invite your friends to. And I kind of felt that we needed to move into a place where people lived rather than kind of really in this middle of nowhere. And so I talked with my dad and my uncles when I was about 22, 23 years old. And I talked with them and said, look, I think we should close that down and we should move into Mendlesham. I'd had this really clear kind of vision or dream that God had given to both Sarah and I at the time after we'd got married. That we should close Brockford Chapel down and move into Mendlesham, which was a larger village nearby. And so I put that to my dad and my uncles, and they said no to start with, but about 6 months later, they agreed that that was the right thing to do. And so we started planning. We pulled people from Mendlesham in, so people like Robin and Sue Johnson, who are still part of us, Ray and Anne Fenning, which was another Fenning family coming to join, but they lived in Mendlesham. And so they became part of the kind of the core team to get it set up. And so we started in November 1992 in the community centre at Mendlesham. It was known as Mendlesham Christian Fellowship at the time. That's how we launched it and started it. And it was very, very relaxed, informal. We tried to keep things as simple as possible. And we wanted to keep this outward focus. And so we would do lots of events that would draw families in. And we started with about, I think there were going to be 22 of us or 23 of us that we knew, including kids. And on that first Sunday, we had 30. So we had visitors there for the first time. And we were just really conscious that we wanted to make it as accessible for people within our community as possible. And so basically, it just started to grow. We had this, the heart behind it then is the same heart behind it now, is that we want to see people find Jesus. We want to see people experiencing the love and the grace and the forgiveness of God. And it was what drove us at the start. It's what still drives us today as a church. And throughout the 28 years, it'll be 29 years in November, we have constantly changed. We've constantly changed because of the growth within the life of the church. And wherever you grow, you have to structure things slightly differently and resource things differently. And I think we have changed and adapted our approach too. So we started off in a community centre in Mendlesham. We went to 2 services in Mendlesham. Then we moved to a bigger premises at Debenham. And then we went from Debenham 1 service to Debenham 2 services, and then to Debenham 2 services and Thurston congregation and the new location. And then we changed again. Then we went to And so there's constantly been this changing. And I think that's really important, because our world changes around us. And so as a church, we can't just stay the same. God stays the same, but the way in which he works and the way in which he works in and through us continually develops and changes us. So, so the church has been an ever-changing church.
That's great. And so as a church, we've got this mission to help people find and follow Jesus, and we'll dig into that a little bit in a couple of questions. But helping people find Jesus just seems to be the thing that you're most passionate about. It seems to just come out time and time again. On Sunday, we just heard loads of stories of just even in this past year, in this year, we've seen people come and find Jesus. And that always seems to be rightly, and perhaps obviously, but maybe not obviously, the thing that you just seem to get the most energy from. And so you called me a couple of weeks ago, 10 o'clock at night, and it was just like, it was just the best news, right? Where is it for you that passion just comes from?
I think growing up in a little church, which was primarily my family, which was incredibly loving. Do you know what I mean? It was a great little church to be part of, and it gave me so many opportunities. The issue was we didn't see people really becoming Christians. And if they did, on the whole, they didn't stay with us. They went to another church. And I always knew that faith sharing was really important, and knew that God's mission was to see people come to him, find him, and follow Jesus. But it wasn't happening. And when I went to... I joined a team when I was age 19 called the Salt Mine Trust. And that was a mission team that would travel all over the UK, and we went abroad too. And suddenly, really for the first time in my life, I started seeing more and more people becoming Christians. There was a rock band, a drama, a theatre company. There was a schools team that I was part of. And we would do all of these events going into a town or a city or even a village. And we would put these events on, and we would encourage people to take a step of following Jesus. And they did. And there was such an excitement, because all I'd heard really until that point is hearing other people's stories. But I hadn't experienced it myself. And so for me to sit and to pray with someone as they come to faith was just so faith building. And it put such a passion within me. So I think in a sense that's been the driver. But I've always wanted the Forge, MCF in the early days, and now the Forge is what we're called. I've always wanted that to have that bias. I've been allowed to have a big influence within the life of the church because I've been the leader over these last 28 years. And so therefore, inevitably, the church gets shaped by who I am. And so therefore, I think I've constantly looked to drive this to say that church is a family, it's a community, it's an organization as well. But primarily our mission is to see people discovering God and finding out his love for them and of what Christ has done for them on the cross, and for them to experience freedom and life and God's grace. There is nothing better. And so you're right, whenever I have that conversation and someone has come to faith, I just want to tell people about it because it's what brings life to me. And when I don't have those stories, I feel myself sinking because that's what we should be about as a church. It's what Jesus came for. I came to seek and to save the lost. And he told stories of the lost son and the lost coin and the lost sheep too. And so much of this was about reaching people that others didn't feel were worthy or were beyond help, kind of thing. And so as a church community, I so long for us to be a community that will show the love of God, speak about the love of God, preach the love of God, and draw people into the love of God too.
And it was a hallmark of one of the early church, early churches as well. Like, one of the most famous passages around the early church we'll look at a little bit this Sunday, but around that, it said all the things that they did, which are amazing. They were following faithfully, but actually one of the hallmarks is that at the end of it, their numbers grew daily. And right. So it makes sense that we ask the questions, what are we doing in order that we see people come and start following Jesus?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think over the years, we've kind of adapted and changed how we've done that. And so in the early days, we used to hold events. We would hold in the 1990s cheese and wine parties, and we would invite people into a home or into a community centre, and we would have a visiting speaker who would come, and we saw people coming to faith that way. In fact, the first family that ever came to faith was through an event like that, and so it was very events orientated. So we would get musicians in, we would get magicians in, we would get drama and comedians in, all with that. And we wanted to bring the message of Jesus at some point within the evening, because that's a way of introducing. And they were great, but they were also just one-off hits. And it was in 96 when I was on a conference. It was a very small conference with a man led by a man called J. John. And he'd invited church leaders. How Sarah and I ever got invited, I have no idea. But people like Steve Chalk, Nicky Gumbel, Matt Redman, and others. And there were about 25 of us. It was remarkable. And Nicky Gumbel was talking about Alpha then. And so we came home from that conference because it had only been launched in the 1990s, in the early 90s. So we came back, we bought the videos, and we did our first Alpha course. And suddenly I found the way in which best fits with who I am. I'm a relational person. I want to be able to build friendships, to be able to have influence and look to encourage people forward. And suddenly Alpha gave this opportunity for a meal, to watch a video. So if anyone disagreed with Nicky Gumbel, it was fine. Nicky Gumbel didn't mind because he was only on video.
Yeah, right.
Whereas if I was trying to give the talks, it might feel a bit more awkward for people. And then a time over 10, 11 weeks just to start to sort through some of the questions that people have, going over the basics of the foundations of the Christian faith. And I loved it, absolutely loved it. And so I've given Alpha away at various times, and then I've got it back again, because for me, that's where I thrive. It was the other week, 2 weeks ago, I came off an Alpha call and a post-Alpha group call. And I said to Sarah, if there was only two things that I was ever allowed to do in life, it would be these two things, because it's what I feel passionate about.
And you've really shown that as well, because in 1996 I was 2, and so literally for my whole life you've been doing those two things.
Oh,
and so that's
and
great.
you're a similar age to my oldest boy Sam.
Yeah.
And we used to have Alphas in our house, and we would often, at the end of an Alpha evening, we would go upstairs, and the kids would have fallen asleep by the stairgate at the top because they were so interested in all of these visitors coming in, and we'd put them to bed, or my mum would have put them to bed, and then they'd got up to creep to listen.
Your kids, not your visitors.
Yes, no, that's right. Okay, yes, that's it. And so it was part of the kids' experience of having all of these people coming into Alpha in our home too.
Great. Yeah, that's great. And so we've talked a lot around helping people find Jesus, but that's not the whole mission. Nope. It's helping people find and follow Jesus. And so I guess, what about those who might say, okay, well, finding Jesus is great, but what about following? What is it that we do for that?
We do lots for that. And I think that it's really important that we see discipleship not as one route, but as lots and lots of different influences that come in to shape us and to help us. at North Point Church, I remember them giving some language to us that I found really helpful. So I think 3 years ago, we did a series called Miracle Grow, where we looked at what is it that God uses to grow our faith. And it was based on a North Point series, 5 Ways to Grow Your Faith. And within that, it's, and this is true for me, that I've grown up listening to some brilliant speakers. And when they've spoken, they've inspired me and they've given me practical steps to take. I remember going to a youth camp and someone was talking about Zacchaeus and a guy called Tim Cutting. And I remember him talking and just saying, look, for some of us, stealing and taking money and stuff like that we need to put that right. If we want to call ourselves Christians, followers of Jesus, we need to put that right. And about a year or so earlier, I'd nicked a whole load of money when doing the paper round from someone, and it just hit me. And I knew, and I talked to someone, and I knew that I had to save money to then go and give that money back to the person in the village that I'd stolen money from. And that's just practical teaching. And so as a church, we look to give practical teaching. So we've done guardrails, which says, what can we do? What can we put in place which will protect us from falling, from having those huge regrets in life? We've gone through breathing room. How do we create space? Because God wants us to live with breathing room, with our finances and with our diaries and with our relationships. And so we're trying to apply the Bible and to make it as practical and as helpful with some next steps to take. And it's really what I think has shaped us as a church. And it's become part of who we are. And so to have information for information's sake is not transformational. We want the teaching and the preaching to be transformational. So practical teaching is one area that I think we work really hard at. Now, are we the best speakers? Well, you're very good, but no, we're not. But what we try to do is to apply the Bible for everyday situations, and that's hard to do at times. I think personal disciplines. I've got. I realise you just had your phone that went off, which is a bit rude. But on my phone here, on the front page, you won't be able to see it, but just there is the YouVersion Bible app. And to encourage people to read the Bible, and not just to do daily plans, but to involve others in that. And so I know various people who message each other. They've done a Bible reading plan for that day, and then they've sent a verse off to a friend, or they've done something to say that we're doing this within community, because I think we learn best and we grow best and we follow Jesus best in community. And so the personal disciplines of praying, of sharing faith, who are we praying for? Just if we as a church can encourage each other to do that. That's why we have running mates to help with that. Pivotal circumstances. Again, stuff hits us in life, and we want to, one, speak into it through our teaching, but secondly, to have people around us who will help to make sense of it. So when someone close to us dies, and they die at a young age, or if we lose our job, it's really easy to think, God, where are you? How could you allow this? Right, if that's where you're going to treat it. And that's where we need other people to bring in the words of God, the voice of God, the reassurance of God into our lives. And so that becomes pivotal circumstances, shapes us. And the church, I think, because of the relationships that we're able to build, can really help that. North Point talk about productive serving. One of the people that tends to watch this, they normally acknowledge that would be Trevor Frost. Yeah. And Trevor went off to Zambia. Went off to Zambia just a few years ago. And I believe that was a pivotal point in his Christian development. Again, the community that he had with the team, but also just the experiences that we have when we serve others, when we come alongside others. I've seen people grow in faith as they've got involved within the life of the church, and they've led small groups, or they've helped in practical ways. Helping with the furniture bank, or helping with the Moses project. All of those things grow our faith because we are serving not just ourselves, but we're serving others, ultimately serving God. And it's a way of following Jesus. So Jesus said, follow my example after he washed the disciples' feet. I've done this to you, now you go and do it. And he set this role model of serving. And so that plays a key part. And we have so many opportunities for people to serve within our community and outside of our church community too. And the final one is provocative relationships. That's why we encourage groups to meet. It's why we encourage running mates. If I look at my own development, I have, I grow because I'm leading Alpha and I'm having to answer questions. I'm leading a post-Alpha group. I've had inspirational people in my life that I've run after to learn from. And all of those people play a part in shaping me and helping me to follow Jesus more closely. So I'm doing the New Testament and the Psalms in a year with Steve Miles, my best friend. And almost every day we are messaging each other. This is the verse that stood out to me. What does this mean? This is the prayer that I ought to be praying today. And it just keeps pushing us forward. And so the church has to have a bias towards reaching the lost. But honestly, how can any Christian be bored if they are committing their lives to helping others find Jesus and then discipling them and helping them to grow in faith, as well as having peers alongside to help them grow? I think it's impossible to be bored as a Christian if we make that our goal. The problem is we don't. And then faith can become boring because we're not living out the life that Jesus called us to.
That's so good. And so you talked a lot about the mission, helping people find and follow Jesus. We could do that mission in so many different ways. And so you've already talked around, at one point it was an event-based way of doing things where you invited people in and the rest of it. And then it could be an alpha-based way of doing things. And so it could be evening meals and the rest of it. For us, though, we've got a vision, and you mentioned it at the end of your talk, of creating church communities that unchurched people love to be a part of. Why is that important?
A vision is seeing something in the future and kind of dragging it into the present. And so I long for us to be a community that is so welcoming, so loving, so compassionate, so in love with Jesus, that people from outside of the church want to be part of it. Want to be part of a community like that. Again, if you go back to the early church, which you mentioned of Acts 2, 42 to 47, people were added daily to their number. Why? Well, it was because they were selling their stuff to be able to give to those who needed something. They were sharing times together, eating meals together. They were worshiping together. They were praying together. There was something so irresistible and so attractive that thousands were added to their number. And that has to be possible today. Culture is very different. And so will we operate in the same way? No, but the heart of who we are can still be the same. And I don't want anything to get in the way of people finding Jesus. And what is God's primary mission aid for helping people find Jesus? It's the church. It's the church community. And so we need to be living that out. And I want us to have nothing that gets in the way. So when we talk about unchurched people, basically we're talking about people who haven't been going to church for the last 6 months or longer. So either they've never been part of a church, or they were part of a church, but then they dropped off and they've kind of let go of it. And so, my heart is to see those who have fallen away come back. They're unchurched. They might have had a church background, but they're unchurched because they haven't been part of a church community to grow and to flourish. And for those who have never been part of a church community. And so, therefore, our language, we need to be really careful that it's not in-house language and inclusive language. Our behavior around that too becomes really important, of how we treat one another and how we welcome other people in. There's that situation in Acts 15 where this big debate that you spoke, I think you spoke about, I can't remember, the other week, where they were talking about whether Gentiles who were coming to faith should become Jewish or not. and they held this. You didn't talk about it. Sorry, that was something else. But they were talking about, do Gentiles have to have a certain piece of skin removed in order to follow Jesus from a very crucial area, that is the men, and whether they should eat kosher food and whether they should become Jewish. And it was James who stood up and said, look, it's my judgment that we shouldn't make it difficult for these people in finding God to follow. And so therefore, I just hold exactly the same. I don't want anything to make it difficult for people to experience the love of God. And I think as a community, we have such an opportunity to express love and welcome and compassion to those outside of the church, which will draw them in. The reason that I think this is so important is because if they are part of us, we can influence because they're close. If they are not part of us, we have no influence over them. And so I want people to be a part of us, because then we can talk, we can debate, we can ask and answer questions, we can work things through with them. And I'm a person who wants to have influence on others, and I can only do that if I have relationship with them. And so therefore, if we can have strong relationship with unchurched people because they love to be part of us, they love what they see, then fantastic. That's the vision that I have for the church.
That feels like it's a good place to finish on this segment of Unpacked Lunch. We're going to be carrying on with the series Grand Designs. Really want to encourage you to watch along. Sundays, as always, 10:30 online, forwardchurch.com, YouTube. There's like a presenter of some sort, but all of that kind of stuff. And so, want to really encourage you to do that. We're going to be looking at what kind of people does Jesus want us to become as his church? What, how is it that we need to behave in that way? What's the value? What's the priority that we need to put above all else? Before we go, though, just really want to not quite wrap up yet, because what we said is that we want to use this time as well, if anyone has questions, to answer them. And so that's a promise we want to keep. Justin put on YouTube a comment to our last week's episode, which was all around what's the starting point of faith. And so just as a real quick recap, you watch back if you're interested. We kind of talked around how the resurrection is the starting point of faith. Without that event, Christianity, you can go home, isn't worth anything, because actually it's around this event that everything stems from. And we talked around that first sort of 300 years, 400 years of Christianity after Jesus came to earth, around what that looked like. So sort of 100 to 451 AD, and we talked about 1996 AD. So we've covered a span in Unpacked Lunch over the past couple of weeks. But Justin had a comment to that. I just want to read that out and just maybe just make just a comment around that, because we said that we would. Justin was in one of our stories in the Curious series, and Justin, we love you. We think you're great. He says this: "Hi guys, is there anything below that you disagree with?" Which is it's a good one, isn't it? So possibly the resurrection is fundamental. I'm good with that. Great. If Jesus is not raised from the dead, then we pack up and go home. I'm good with that as well. We believe Jesus because of the Bible, and we believe in the Bible because of Jesus. I think I'm there with that as well. For the vast majority of skeptics, Jesus is the impossible to deny, irresistible person that we are drawn to before we get very near the Bible. It would be really sad and bad if the Bible, including the Old Testament, Jesus sits in and about whom it exists, began to diminish in the eyes of those skeptics they come to trust in Jesus. And so I think the heart of the question is, it's kind of like this chicken and egg thing. Is it the Bible, then Jesus, then the Bible? I think that's kind of the thing. I'm not sure if I read out that question in the way that it was supposed to be read out. But I think so for me, it's a subtle difference in terms of what comes first. And it's often that phrase, the Bible says, therefore we do it, that often becomes, it's sneaky, but I think it's a subtle difference in terms of what comes first. For me, I would always land on the resurrection becoming the most important fundamental event before the Bible, because actually, whilst we do believe it now because the Bible says, there was a point where the Bible wasn't the Bible. And actually, the first questions that the early church fathers asked was not, what's the Bible? What are the things that God says God says? Actually, it was, before that, is Jesus who he said he was? And to do that, they looked at the accounts, and they looked at accounts of people before they were Bible, in a sense, and they said, well, what's the evidence for Jesus being who he says he was? And actually from that, we can then listen to the Bible because Jesus says so, and the claims that the Bible makes, and all of those different things. So I think it's a subtle difference, but I think part of the reason why it's important, particularly in the conversation that we've just had in terms of helping people find and follow Jesus, is that people coming to find Jesus, if they're told, believe in Jesus because that's what the Bible says, the Bible becomes a house of cards. Because all it takes is for someone to say, well, what about this bit that I'm not sure about? If they find Jesus and then come to find the Bible as a result of Jesus, the Bible's far more strong because actually you read it through the lens of Jesus anyway. But I also think that actually it's the first thing comes first. And so the three words almost that you can try and, now I know Justin will know this anyway, but if you're watching along and you don't, three words for the day might be inerrancy, infallibility, and inspiration, I guess. And so those are the three words that are sort of thrown around the Bible. Inerrancy really means that it can't have any errors. And so the way to think about that is like mathematical equation. If it doesn't fit with the maths, then it's wrong. It's got to be inerrant. And in a sense, the Bible is that, but it's not that. Some parts would be claimed to be, but that's kind of where it falls down because there are things in it that are written poetically, that are written in ways that you're not supposed to see mathematically. And so it will have errors of sorts. You can even look at certain books and you can say, well, is this written perfectly in human ways? Is this written as a perfect piece of poetry? And some might come close, but that's kind of where it might become a little bit difficult. I think what we can say is that it's infallible, which is a better way of looking at it as almost like this compass pointing in the right direction. And so whilst there might be rocks and traverses and the rest of it, we can have this compass that points us in the direction of God. But something that it also is it's inspired. And so the way I love this being described is almost if you imagine an orchestra, you can have all these different instruments. And if God is the person who blows through it, it might sound in different ways from the different people who wrote the different parts of the Bible. Actually, it's that same breath that gives it the noise it's supposed to give. And so absolutely believe the Bible is central to what we believe. We believe that. We believe that, it's perhaps the way in which God has chosen to speak to us, perhaps more than any other. But I don't think that contradicts. And I think that Jesus is the starting point of faith.
He is, absolutely. And again, on Alpha, Nicky Gumbel just talks about how can we be sure of faith? And he talks about the three, or the tripod of the three legs of the tripod, where he talks about, he says that I'm married and I can go back to an event, and that we can go back to an event in history of Jesus' death and resurrection, that's what our faith is built on. It's built on an event that's taken place. He also then holds up his marriage certificate, and he says, so there is a document that also, and therefore we have the Bible. And so our faith is built on the word of God too. And then he talks about his experience of being married all of those years. And we have the experience of knowing God and of following him. And it's not one against the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
We need all three for that. But ultimately, our faith and the church, the early church's faith, was built on the resurrection of Jesus.
Great.
Without the resurrection of Jesus, there was no faith.
Great. Cool. So a bit of an extra long unpacked lunch today, but if you're still with us, hey, well done. Hope that you have a good dinner time. But join us on Sunday, as I said, for the next part of Grand Designs, and next week as we carry on with Unpacked Lunch.
Yeah.
See you then.